Hi, I'd like to introduce Natasha Cherry. Ms. Cherry is the Director of Family and Community Engagement for the Poughkeepsie School District in Poughkeepsie, New York. Natasha was born and raised in Poughkeepsie and earned her associate degree at Dutchess Community College. She holds a bachelor's degree in history from SUNY New Paltz and a master's degree in public administration from Marist College. Ms. Cherry has spent her career working and volunteering for youth. She has done everything from youth counseling, job coaching, project management, basketball, football coaching, teaching, and school administration. In 2015, Ms. Cherry realized that having a voice in city government would help influence more programs and opportunities for young Black people, so she decided to run for the City of Poughkeepsie Common Council, a seat she has held for the past 5 years, including a term as the chairperson. Thank you. Natasha?
Nice speech. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm honored to be here today to talk a little bit about the Black suffrage movement in particular. I am going to talk a little bit of historical terms first, and then towards the end, I can talk a little more about my personal experiences and answer. I would like to thank the organizers of the We Rise tribute for taking the time to acknowledge 100 years of voting rights for many women.
Oh, there we are.
Voting rights were approved on August 26, 1920, which is the day before my birthday, not 1920, much later. But I feel like there's no coincidence that I was born around that time. You know, I feel like I was born to be a leader and born to do the things that I do for women's rights. I would also like to thank them for including a segment on the Black suffrage movement. Many times we lump all of our histories together, and there's so many other significant parts of history that sometimes get overshadowed and are important in themselves, so we need to also include them, sometimes like this separately, in the context of the bigger picture and not just in the big picture. As Mary said, I received my undergraduate degree in history from New Paltz. But one thing she didn't mention is that I minored in Black studies. And that wasn't a coincidence. Many people would think, why would you major in history and minor in Black studies when it's
You should all do it. There's somebody else trying to.
Can anybody hear me? I see we've got audio problems. Anybody else have an audio?
No, the host, the speakers.
I hear you, it's the speaker we can't hear. Prelude to the civil rights
Now
movement,
she's unmuted.
Separate section or separate class. Although it is true that the Black suffragists were influential to the civil rights movement, Black suffragists were also influential to many other movements, some of which I will discuss tonight. This brings me back to the reason that I chose to minor in Black studies, because American history should never be his story. It must always be our story, the story of us. Some historians would say the Black suffrage movement ended around the time of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, while others would argue that the movement never really ended, but has remained stagnant and flat for the last 50 years. I tend to subscribe to the latter because although Black women have gained the right to vote and participate in political processes, their voices are many times unheard. Black women still have to rely on their white sisters for support and advocacy. This in itself is not a bad thing, but I look forward to the day where there's no distinction between white women and Black women. I look for the day that we are simply called women. The question is, why is it taking so long? Wasn't it Sojourner Truth herself who asked the question, ain't I a woman? When we speak of the Black suffragist movement in relation to U.S. history, there are several names we must never forget. And I will speak about a few of my favorites tonight. Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Does anyone know who she is? Unsung heroes. This is what I should have called this section. Mary Ann Shadd Cary was born a free Black woman, but dedicated a great part of her early life as an abolitionist, assisting fugitive slaves to safety. Aside from being a teacher, she became the first Black female attorney in the U.S. That's why it's so important that we should know her. Of her many accomplishments, she joined the women's suffragist movement and fought for human rights alongside Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which I'm sure everyone has heard of. She testified before the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee in support of women voting rights. She was also the first Black woman to cast a vote in a national U.S. election. This is why it's not just his story, right? Lastly, she was also the first Black woman to publish her own newspaper, the Provincial Freeman. Mary Church Terrell, does anyone know who she is? Mary Church Terrell also promoted education as a tool of empowerment for Black women. Formed with her friend and co-founder Josephine Pierre, the first elite Black women's clubs. And you'll see in the story of Black women suffragists, newspapers and clubs, social clubs, they became an important agency for Black women to get together, to unify and mobilize. Together with her friend Josephine, they started the National Association of Colored Women. From that organization, several sororities and other social clubs came about. Ms. Terrell's statement, "Lifting as we climb," I'm sure everyone has heard that, has become a national slogan for all women's rights, not just the Black suffragist movement, not just the white women's suffragist movement, but for all women's rights.
This is the first time she ever got that.
In 1950, at the age of 86 years old, she led a protest in Washington, D.C. against segregated restaurants. 86 years old. Can you imagine? 3 years later, the Supreme Court ruled segregating eating facilities unconstitutional, a big early win for the civil rights movement. One of the many lasting contributions Ms. Terrell made to Women Club Society was co-founding the College Alumni Club, which is later known and is still in existence today as the National Organization of University Women. One of the most perhaps under-recognized, strongest and powerful women in the Black suffragist movement was Ida B. Wells. Ms. Wells was born a slave but became free as a child right after the Civil War. Much like Mary Church Terrell, she believed education is the biggest weapon that can be used against inequality. At the young age of 16, she became a teacher and also a mother to her younger brothers and sisters, losing both of her parents to the yellow fever and some of her other siblings. Through that all, she still would go on. And in her time, many would have considered Ms. Wells as radical because she wanted the women's suffragist movement to also take on anti-lynching movement. She was a big fighter against the mistreatment of Black males in the South. She wanted that movement to combined. So because of this, she kind of went on her own way, continuing to fight for women's rights. She began publishing investigative reports exposing much of the cruel treatment of Blacks. She would later go on to form the National Association of Colored Women's Club, served in a National Equal Rights League, and became one of the co-founders of the NAACP. The three women that I spoke about have tremendously impacted not only women's suffrage, but their contributions have made a permanent imprint on our American culture. Education, writing, and social clubs and organizations continue to provide women, all women, with avenues to equity and the ability to organize and power to mobilize. The Black suffragist movement has never ended. It has, however, slowed down. We, as Black women, have gained equity with a right to vote and the ability to participate in political processes, but our access to government and our influence on government functions is still limited. Our voice is not loud enough alone. Again, I say we still rely on the support of our white sisters and allies. And again, this is not a bad thing. But we should not need anyone else to validate our struggle. Once we as Black women are fully accepted for who we are and what we represent, we will truly achieve enfranchisement. This year, 2020, is very, very important for women, all women, but especially Black women. We have an unprecedented number of Black women congressional candidates at 130. Many of them winning their primaries by landslides. We have a record number of Black women serving as mayors of large cities, and I get chills just thinking about this. Cities such as San Francisco, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Chicago. And last but not least, we have a Black woman who is our vice presidential candidate for the United States of America. I will say this is a win for women everywhere with you.
Yeah.
In closing, Black women are increasingly being recognized as major contributors in politics, but we still are forced to identify ourselves as Black first and women second. I look forward to the day when we simply will all be identified as women. I will end by repeating the words of Sojourner Truth. Ain't I a woman?
Have a question? Any questions from our audience, Ms. Cherry? Don't be shy. No.
Yeah, when did you start, what inflamed your interest in history, in particular Black history? I mean, I know you said that it's being missing, which I agree, as being raised in this country, it was absolutely missing.
So my story is a little unique, but not unusual. I grew up in a biracial household. My mother is white. My father is African American. And I did not find people that looked like me for a long time. I didn't look very Black as a child. I didn't look very white either. And as a young child, I would get lost into television, things like Little House on the Prairie. But I never saw anyone tan with Black hair.
Right.
You know, so as I got engulfed in those kinds of things, I started going to, we had neighborhood libraries at that time. And I would go to the Maplewood Library. I was an avid reader ever since I could read. My mother said I was reading before school. I'm still an avid reader. I would get lost in so many books. I loved books. I loved everything from Cynthia Voigt. Again, I said Little House on the Prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder, Judy Blume. But still, I never really identified with any of those people. But what I did realize is that I was really interested in different time periods. in different places. So that passion and that hobby actually developed into, my knack for history. And plus I was really good at it. I'm not good at math. I'll admit my fault. I'm not good at math, but I'm very good at remembering. And history is all about memory, and making connections. The deeper you get in history, you make connections to and parallels. History always repeats itself in one way or another. I'm seeing that true in my 43 years of life. It may not look exactly the same, but it looks very similar. And we can know what to expect, right? It's up to us to change history. So after I went to get my bachelor's in history, my intention was to be a teacher. And I got accepted to Marist, to the School of Education. But the weirdest thing happened. You have to write an entrance exam to get into grad school. So basically an essay. And the School of Public Administration actually called me and said, I know you're registered to go into school education, but we would like to offer you some sort of scholarship because you really have a knack for leadership. So that's how I got into public administration, but I still loved education. So I went on and got my advanced degree in educational leadership. So that's how I got into history. Go ahead, ask me anything. My favorite color is blue.
Well, I like history myself, and do you have any more of the backstories? Because Ida B. Wells, she was a tremendous woman, and I like that you brought out her backstory, having lost her family and having to take on a heavy responsibility and still try to fight for human rights was amazing. That's a unique power of many, many Black women.
So with Ida B. Wells, she's one of my favorites actually. And there's so many stories about her and so many details, but I chose to limit it tonight because there's different historical accounts about her because she was very opinionated. Mm-hmm. So some things that you may read about her, I couldn't really digest as true. Some historians try to paint her like as this radical, going against the grain. She didn't get along with the movement. That really wasn't who she was. She just was really passionate about not only fighting for women, but fighting for Black people in general. So I didn't want to add too much and paint, a picture that I could not finish for the audience. So I just tried to capture, her the best I could in a manner that most people who haven't studied her would understand. And another thing too, there's different accounts about her being a co-founder of the NAACP. You know that some people don't want to give her credit for that because she was actually in Canada when it was created, but she was a big part of it and a thought partner with W.E.B. Du Bois. A lot of people don't know that as well. She was a extremely big thought partner for a lot of people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the themes that we're seeing in our We Rise project, we have a couple of films coming up this weekend about women in the arts and how women's stories have been erased from the history. That there were very prominent and successful women painters in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, some who even exhibited alongside men, and yet we don't know their names as we know the names of their male counterparts. And, we don't know the names of those Black suffragettes. We don't know the names of those Black women who were, stood shoulder to shoulder or led, ahead of people like Susan B. Anthony or others. I mean, how do you think that we can unearth that and bring that to light so we have a more accurate and full picture of what women contributed?
I think the first thing we all can do is care, just like you said, showing that we care and we want to dig deeper. The information's out there and we can put the puzzle together, but it's up to us as women to unify and say, you know what, we're no longer going to accept this as our story. This is not our story. Here's our story. And to do that, to rewrite history and to change our story, we need more women in power. We need more women, not just in political power, more women in charge of educational institutions, more women on the front lines. We need to work together as women, encourage each other as women, and really work closely with young women to nurture whatever it is they want to do and exalt them. So once we all unify as women, and there's no more, I'm a Black woman, I'm a Latina woman, I'm a white woman. When we unify as women and we sit down collectively and tell our stories, because I'm sure there's part of white women's suffrage movement that's inaccurate as well, you know? Once we get together, we share our stories, and we put more women in power, we'll rewrite the history and we'll have a more accurate portrayal of who we are as women and where we came from.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question?
What would you like to see in our public schools? How would you like to see these kinds of issues approached, even in kindergarten, grade school, you know, young people? How would you want this kind of thing dealt with? This is
Well, even now in our curriculum, there's pretty well defined gender distinctions, right? And nowadays, us as women, we've evolved so much that we are now accepting people who may not have been doctor identified as female at birth, right? So that's starting the change, that we're accepting whoever wants to be a woman as a woman. We need to do a better job of not classifying masculinity and femininity. You know, a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this sometimes too, because that's how we were taught. But you know, when we talk about women in history, you know, that we always have to paint them delicately, and they were so beautiful, and you know, graceful and charming, and then men are fearless, ferocious fighters. You know, we have to really start talking about women in history in the same manner that we talk about men, thus giving us equity. You know, because I feel like when we soften women, when we talk about them, it takes away from our power. And that's why we still have not achieved equality with men fully. We're still looked at as, I would say, second-class citizens. We're still not treated equally. We're still not paid equally. You know, we're still discriminated against, you know, whether it's our age or if we have children, or, you know, we still are, or our job abilities, you know, we need to teach teachers how to talk about people.
I think we have a question from Ray Watkins.
Hi.
Hi.
How you guys doing?
Okay.
You guys are doing a wonderful job. I really appreciate this, and thanks for letting me and there's a couple other fellas here, so I don't feel too bad. But you know what I found to be fascinating, as far as the women's movement. My family migrated up here back in the 30s, early 30s, and they were leaving old Jim Crow and everything else that was down south. But I found that the people that you mentioned today, they're outstanding people. And I found just stories from, and you know, I grew up in the early civil rights days, but my family, my grandmother, my mother, my aunts, they all grew up before, well, my mother was born a year before women were given the right to vote. but they have some fascinating stories. And if you really want to get to know yourselves, and you have family that are still living, that lived through some of this stuff, you'd be amazed by what you can find out about women's suffrage. I have a cousin who lives, or my mother's cousin who lives in Georgia, and she was coming up here to live, and she was going to take a bus, and she was really country. She didn't knew nothing about Jim Crow, you know. So she got on the bus while the driver was still at the getting coffee, and she actually took a seat right behind where the driver was, and he told her, "Gal, you got to go in the back." You know, she said, "Well, I'm fine right where I'm at." You know, she didn't know. You know, she was right out of the woods. She didn't know that she had to go. She said, "I'm just fine right here. This is a good seat." And he wouldn't move. He wouldn't move that bus until she finally went in the back. And then when they got up there near the Mason-Dixon line, she was allowed to move freely, but she decided to stay. Those stories really fascinated me later in life. Not so much when I was when I was real young, but those stories. I mean, there were so many stories about strong women or crazy women that you can find right from your family. Locally, I mean, locally, the Hudson Valley is flooded with great women, and I'm sure that you're going to hear more and more about them, including our judge, who's a product of Poughkeepsie. And I mean, there's a wealth of stuff that you can find yourselves without going too far, and most of it's documented. The stuff that's not documented, of course, you can get from an old family member. They remember, and that can help you with understanding what not only Black women but women in general, and Black people and people in general coming up through this era. You know, and you do get a different perspective on things when you hear it from your own people. My father, he used to sing every Sunday morning on WKIP from 1941 till to 1945, I think, at the old Nelson House garage. And he was in a little quartet group. They were called the Hudson Jubilee Singers. Now, they would sing every Sunday morning religiously for about 4 or 5 years. But if he wanted to have a romantic evening with my mother at the Nelson House, that was a no. He couldn't do that.
Wow.
So, just
thank you. Those are great stories, and those are things that we treasure. And I think you're right. When we're little and everybody wants to tell us those stories, we're not so interested. But then we start to realize the value of collecting them.
Yes.
So I'd like to
That's
thank.
so true.
We're going to get ready to bring on Angela Henry. So a big round of applause.
I'm getting a little bit hot. Okay.